The problem with becoming the Queen Mother wasn't that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon lost the word Queen. It was that she found a way to keep it. In 1952, her daughter inherited the throne at 25. Her husband was dead. Her reign as Queen Consort was over. But somehow, for the next 50 years, Elizabeth II was still living with a second royal gravity in the room, a mother who had stepped down in title, but not in expectation. This isn't the grief story. You already know the grief story. This is the other one, the one about a title, a parliamentary annuity, a Coutts Bank overdraft, and a daughter who happened to be a queen. It's a structural argument, not a personal one, and the structure begins with a single word: queen. Not Queen Consort, not Dowager, not widow. Queen, appearing first in the title, setting the psychological register, anchoring the financial entitlement, and following Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon for the rest of her remarkably long life. To understand why that word did so much work for 50 years, you have to understand who the woman was before she ever needed it. And that story begins not in 1952, but in 1900, when the whole thing was still entirely improbable. On August 4, 1900, the 9th child of Claude Bowes-Lyon, Earl of Strathmore, was born. The family was British nobility, old money, Scottish estates, Glamis Castle with its ancestral stone and its peacocks. But not royalty, not anywhere close. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was christened in a local parish church in Hertfordshire and grew up between St. Paul's Waldenbury in England and Glamis in Scotland, riding ponies and running through her father's lands. As one contemporary biography put it, at her birth on 4 August 1900, the boldest soothsayer would have been rash to predict that in less than 40 years, Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon would be the wife of a king. The First World War reached Glamis when she was 14. 4 of her brothers served. Her eldest brother Fergus, an officer in the Black Watch, was killed at the Battle of Luce in 1915. Another, Michael, went missing in April 1917 and was later found to have been captured. Glamis Castle was converted into a convalescent home for wounded soldiers, and Elizabeth helped run it. She was 15 and 16 years old. By the time the war ended, she was a young woman who had watched men arrive broken and leave either mended or not at all. She was, by every account, formidably charming. Not beautiful in the conventional sense. Photographs show a round, watchful face and an expression that suggested she was about to find something amusing. But she drew people in. Prince Albert, the second son of George V, proposed to her in 1921. She turned him down. He proposed again in 1922. She turned him down again, reportedly afraid, as she wrote privately, of never being free to think, speak, and act as she felt she ought. The third proposal came in January 1923. She accepted, despite her misgivings about royal life. They married at Westminster Abbey on April 26, 1923, and she became, without any particular plan, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. For 13 years, she was comfortable in that role. Albert, Bertie as the family called him, was the second son, the spare. The heir was his older brother David, the Prince of Wales, who was wildly popular and apparently suitable for the crown. Elizabeth and Albert had 2 daughters, Elizabeth, born in 1926, and Margaret, born in 1930, and a domestic life that was consciously separate from the spotlight of succession. Then came January 20th, 1936. George V died, and David became Edward VIII. Within months, the constitutional crisis that would reshape everything was in motion. The king's determination to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson, the government's refusal to accommodate it, and the abdication that followed on December 11, 1936. Albert became King George VI that day, reluctantly, at the age of 40. Elizabeth became Queen Consort. Their 10-year-old daughter, Lilibet, became heir presumptive. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was 36 when she became queen. She had not sought it. She had, by her own reported admission, married into the Yorks precisely because they seemed comfortably unlikely to ever sit on the throne. But she adapted with a speed and completeness that surprised observers. The coronation on May 12, 1937, the same date originally set for Edward's coronation, placed a crown on her head. Her crown was made of platinum, set with the Koh-i-Noor diamond. She stood in Westminster Abbey beside a man who was visibly terrified of his new position, and who still stuttered severely in public. And she looked entirely at ease. The 15 years that followed, from the coronation to George VI's death, were the years that built her public capital. They are also the years that make the hierarchy problem of 1952 so structurally interesting, because by the time her husband died, the woman Elizabeth II had to manage had not merely been queen for 15 years. She had been the defining public face of the monarchy during its most consequential test. The Second World War began when she had been queen for just over 2 years. What happened next cemented her into the national story in a way that outlasted the war by decades. She and George VI stayed in London during the Blitz. She refused to send her daughters to Canada. She visited bombed areas of the East End, wearing the kind of gentle pastel clothing her designer, Norman Hartnell, had developed specifically for wartime morale. She toured hospitals, munitions factories, devastated streets. Initially, the crowds in the hardest-hit neighborhoods were hostile. Rubbish was thrown at her, the reaction acidic from people who read her expensive clothes as alienation. She kept going. When Buckingham Palace itself was bombed, taking 9 direct hits across the course of the war, she said something that became one of the most quoted lines of her public life, that she was glad the palace had been bombed because it meant she could look the East End in the face. Adolf Hitler reportedly called her the most dangerous woman in Europe, viewing her popularity as a specific threat to German interests. That characterization, however one regards its source, captures something real about what she had become by 1945. She wasn't merely the king's wife, she was the war's mother. The calm, resolute, impeccably dressed figure who stood in rubble and smiled. By the time George VI's health began failing in the late 1940s, a progressive lung condition that led to a pneumonectomy in September 1951, the surgical removal of his left lung, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had been at the visible center of the British monarchy for 15 years. She was more photographed than her daughter. She was more beloved by popular measurement. She had a public identity that was entirely her own, built on decisions she had made during the hardest years of the 20th century. Her daughter, Lilibet, had grown up in her shadow. The Princess Elizabeth, who became queen at 25 in 1952, was accomplished, duty-bound, and clearly capable. But she had not yet had the opportunity to demonstrate most of that. The daughter was inheriting the crown. The mother was surrendering it. And the mother had been doing it longer, and had done it more publicly, and had made it look, at the worst moments, easier than it was. That is the biographical foundation of the hierarchy problem. Not that the Queen Mother was difficult or grasping, but that she had spent 15 years becoming irreplaceable in the public imagination, and then she survived her husband by 50 years. The morning the irreplaceability became a structural problem was February 6, 1952, Sandringham House, Norfolk. George VI was 56. The September pneumonectomy had given him months rather than years, though the palace had managed the information carefully. On January 31st, against the advice of those around him, he had gone to Heathrow Airport to wave off his daughter and her husband as they departed for a Commonwealth tour of East Africa and Australasia. It was, though no one said so publicly, a goodbye. He stood on the tarmac in the cold and watched Elizabeth's plane disappear. 6 days later, a servant found him dead in his bed. Coronary thrombosis. His reign had lasted 15 years and 57 days. Elizabeth wasn't in England. She and Philip had spent the previous night at Treetops Hotel in Kenya, watching game from the platform above a watering hole. By morning, they were back at Sagana Lodge, a property the Kenyan people had given them as a wedding gift. Philip's private secretary received the message first. Then Philip found his wife and told her. She had been queen, by that point, for approximately the last several hours without knowing it. She was 25. At Sandringham, her mother was 51. She had been Queen Consort since 1937. She had known the weight of the crown in her hands, on her head, in the public response to her presence, for 15 years. Whatever role she had been performing, official consort, wartime symbol, the human face of a monarchy under pressure, it had required her at its center. And now, constitutionally and instantly, it was over. This is the moment the hierarchy should have clarified itself. The daughter was queen, the mother wasn't. The constitutional language was clean. The widow of a king becomes a queen dowager. Her status is preserved in ceremonial terms. Her role as central figure in the monarchy is finished. Except it wasn't. Not entirely. Not in practice. Not for 50 years. The word at the center of this argument is dowager, specifically its absence. In British constitutional practice, the widow of a king is a queen dowager. She retains the style of queen, the Her Majesty prefix, the ceremonial precedence, but she is explicitly marked as past. The word dowager comes from the Old French douagière, denoting a widow who holds a title derived from her dead husband rather than from any current position of her own. To be a dowager is to be defined by precedence. The word that follows you is the word that announces your diminishment. In practice, British widowed Queen's Consort had not been styled Dowager Queen first name since the early modern period. The operational style in use was Her Majesty Queen first name, name without qualifier. Queen Alexandra, widowed in 1910 when Edward VII died, was Her Majesty Queen Alexandra for the remaining 15 years of her life. Queen Mary, widowed in January 1936, was Her Majesty Queen Mary through 2 subsequent reigns and into the early months of a third, dying in March 1953 at the age of 85. Neither woman was formally styled Dowager Queen. The legal status was there, the daily title wasn't. So the argument about what happened in February 1952 isn't that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon rejected a formal title she should have had. The argument is more precise than that. What happened, according to Robert Lacey's account in Queen and Country, is that a few days after George VI's death, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon made an announcement. She now wished to be called Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. In Lacey's telling, the declaration came with a statement directed at the public. I commend to you our dear daughter. Give her your loyalty and love. 2 Queen Elizabeths existed simultaneously. The disambiguation argument is real. Had the widowed queen simply continued as Queen Elizabeth, the style precedent suggested, the confusion would have been genuine and persistent. Newspapers would have been ambiguous. Official correspondence would have required constant clarification. So the addition of the Queen Mother wasn't irrational. But what that addition did, beyond disambiguation, was something structurally significant. It explicitly advertised an ongoing identity. Not Queen Elizabeth, widow. Not Queen Elizabeth, now retired. Queen Elizabeth, and then, crucially, the Queen Mother. A role title, a position title, an active noun, not a passive one. The declaration that her most important function wasn't the widowhood she had just entered, but the maternity she had exercised for 26 years. That she was the mother of the reigning sovereign. That the reigning sovereign's legitimacy ran partly through her. The word queen appeared first. That ordering mattered in ways that went beyond alphabetical arrangement. In the British system, any widowed queen consort would have kept queen in her style regardless. Alexandra kept it. Mary kept it. But Queen Alexandra and Queen Mary are names. They place the woman in the past tense of her husband's reign. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, is a statement of continued centrality. It defines her not by what she had been, consort to a dead king, but by what she remained, the mother of the current one. A position that does not expire when the king does. A position that lasts, structurally, as long as the daughter reigns. Queen Mary reportedly preferred Queen Mother to Dowager Queen herself. The sentiment appears to have been consistent across generations. The word dowager carried what it carried: the grammar of succession, the explicit marking of passage, the placing of a woman clearly behind rather than beside. No one who had worn a crown during a war wanted to be introduced as a dowager. William Shawcross was granted access to the Queen Mother's private papers for his official biography, published in 2009. The Guardian's review of that biography contains one of the most direct assessments available. According to Shawcross, she was deeply in debt most of the time. And a brief reference preserved in press coverage of the biography's release captures a fragment of her own voice on the subject of titles. A private observation, apparently written, beginning, "horrible name," before the record goes silent. What she was describing with those two words isn't entirely clear from what survives. Whether the object was the title itself, the word dowager, or the whole implied diminishment of widowhood, the Shawcross material clearly establishes a woman who found the transition objectionable in ways that the public record of smiling royal widowhood was designed to conceal. She was 51. She had known power for 15 years. And she chose, or accepted, or arranged, a title that preserved Queen first, that kept her architecturally connected to the center of the monarchy, and that left her daughter managing that architecture for the rest of her life. Before the practical consequences, one more thing needs to be understood about how the title worked psychologically. The palace in February 1952 could have settled on something different. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth Dowager, or simply, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the established British style, without the Queen Mother qualifier, handling disambiguation through context and household communications. The specific innovation of the Queen Mother as an official style wasn't an inevitability. It was a choice. And what that choice created was a mutually reinforcing logic. The reigning monarch is the daughter. The daughter requires a mother. The mother is a queen. The logic runs in both directions, and in both directions, the older woman remains structurally essential. Not peripheral, not historical. Essential, by virtue of her relationship to the current sovereign. Winston Churchill was Prime Minister in February 1952. He sent his urgent telegram to Elizabeth in Kenya when the king died. He stood in the Commons and delivered a eulogy. He was present throughout the institutional machinery of the transition, but no documentary evidence places him at the center of the title decision. The decision appears, from the available record, to have been Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's own expressed preference, shaped by the practical disambiguation need, ratified by the palace, and announced by her personally. Which makes it more interesting than if it had been imposed. She chose it. The title that defined the next 50 years was, by Lacey's account, one she put forward herself. Now, the money. The money is where the title's consequences became material. A title is symbolic. A parliamentary annuity is a number, and the Queen Mother's numbers across 50 years of widowhood weren't small. The Civil List Act, 1952, established Elizabeth II's own civil list at £475,000 per year, confirmed in Hansard from the debate of July 9, 1952, when Chancellor R.A. Butler moved the provisions before the committee. The Queen Mother received a separate parliamentary annuity under the civil list legislation, a distinct grant, not a subhead of the Queen's own budget, but voted by Parliament under the same framework. In 1975, Hansard records her allowance at £95,000 per year, noted as subject to tax. In a 1971 civil list debate, Hansard records that the Queen Mother carried out 211 official engagements that year, which was the parliamentary justification for the provision. By 1990, the numbers had changed substantially. The civil list, Increase of Financial Provision Order, 1990, a statutory instrument, recorded at legislation.gov.uk under Statutory Instrument Number 2018 of 1990, raised her allowance from £334,400 to £643,000 per year. That is the primary legal source for the figure, not a tabloid estimate, not a press approximation, but a parliamentary order on the public record. The same order raised Prince Philip's annuity from £186,500 to £359,000. The Queen Mother's allowance was, at that point, nearly double Philip's. From 1975 to 1990, her parliamentary provision had increased from £95,000 to £643,000. That is a nearly seven-fold increase across 15 years, well beyond what straightforward inflation adjustment would produce. The trajectory reflects the ongoing expansion of the role and the ongoing expectation that she would maintain a certain scale of public presence. These were parliamentary annuities, public money drawn from the Consolidated Fund, voted under civil list legislation. They weren't private gifts from Elizabeth II. What matters for the structural argument isn't just the size of the sum, but what happened to it in 1993. In March 1993, Elizabeth II entered into a voluntary agreement to begin paying income tax and capital gains tax. The arrangement, confirmed in Hansard from March 5, 1993, also provided that she would refund to the Treasury the costs of parliamentary annuities paid to other members of the royal family. The specific wording in the Hansard record is plain. Her Majesty the Queen has agreed to refund those costs, except for the annuities for the Queen Mother and the Duke of Edinburgh. Accepted, specifically, by name. Every other royal receiving a parliamentary annuity had that cost effectively absorbed back into royal finances. The Queen Mother and Philip didn't. Their public annuities continued as direct charges on the Consolidated Fund, unreimbursed. Given that the Queen Mother's annuity stood at £643,000 a year from 1990 onward, and the Wikipedia article on the finances of the British royal family confirms that by 2002, 8 recipients were receiving a combined total of £1.5 million annually. This exception wasn't administrative oversight. It was a deliberate protection of 2 specific provisions from the general reform. The Queen, who was voluntarily assuming costs across the wider royal family, specifically didn't absorb her mother's public provision. She could have. She chose not to. That decision is worth holding for a moment, because it cuts in 2 directions. It demonstrates the protective instinct, the daughter's refusal to make her mother's position financially precarious by routing the annuity through the Duchy of Lancaster rather than direct public provision. But it also demonstrates the limit of the story that claims Elizabeth II was simply a loving daughter doing her best. She had institutional options she didn't take. The 1993 exception was a choice, and the Hansard record shows it clearly. Now the private side of the ledger. The public annuity was one thing. What biographers, newspapers, and the official biography all converge on is a second, parallel financial story. The Queen Mother regularly spent beyond her income, and the gap went somewhere. The Guardian, on March 31, 2002, the day after the Queen Mother's death, described the end of an aristocratic era of style, opulence, and overdrafts. The characterization wasn't posthumous tabloid unkindness. It was the settled understanding of journalists who had been covering the royal family for decades. Her wealth at death was estimated at £26 million. Her spending, simultaneously, was acknowledged to have regularly exceeded her income. A Financial Times piece from 2008 addressed the matter more specifically. Elizabeth II subsidized her mother, the piece states, and was reported to have paid off her overdraft at Coutts Bank after her death. The FT isn't a tabloid. It qualifies the claim. Reported to have. But it treats it as established enough to mention in a mainstream financial context. The Shawcross official biography, published in 2009 with access to private papers that no journalist or independent researcher could reach, provides the most authoritative version of the pattern. According to The Guardian's review of that biography, Shawcross found that she was deeply in debt most of the time. Not occasionally, not in a bad year, most of the time. The sources of that debt aren't mysterious. She owned racehorses, a substantial and expensive passion shared with her daughter, who was also a serious racehorse owner. She maintained Clarence House with a staff whose annual wage costs, according to a Spectator account by royal journalist Robert Hardman, ran to approximately £1.5 million per year, considerably more than her entire £643,000 parliamentary allowance. She entertained on a royal scale, operated multiple households, including Royal Lodge at Windsor, and maintained the full apparatus of a working senior royal well into her 90s. The biography, Monarch, The Life and Reign of Elizabeth II, provides the most specific detail on how Elizabeth II covered the gap. Payments came chiefly from funds from the Duchy of Lancaster, the private income stream, not public money. This framing is consistent with the general royal finances framework: sovereign grant and parliamentary annuities for official duties, Duchy of Lancaster income for private and family expenses. Whatever Elizabeth II absorbed on her mother's behalf, the available evidence points to private funds, not taxpayer money. The exact figure on any Coutts overdraft isn't confirmed in primary banking documents that are publicly available. Press accounts vary. The pattern they describe, chronic, recurring, absorbed by the daughter, is consistent across multiple independent sources. What can be said with confidence is this: the woman the biographies describe as perpetually in debt, living significantly beyond her public income, wasn't living in a vacuum. Someone was absorbing the consequences. The Duchy of Lancaster was absorbing them. The mechanism linking the title to the money runs like this. A woman styled Queen Mother does not quietly downsize. The title carries expectation. It carries the kind of household, the kind of entertaining, the kind of continued public presence that the public and the institution have come to associate with queenship. A woman styled something more explicitly past tense, a widow, a dowager, operates under different social and institutional pressure. Different people feel entitled to suggest economies. Different adjustments become possible without appearing to diminish the monarchy itself. The title that kept Queen first also kept the lifestyle that goes with Queen first. And the lifestyle that exceeds the income provided for it becomes the problem of whoever is ultimately responsible for the institution. That was Elizabeth II. The rooms tell part of the same story. When Elizabeth II became queen, she and Philip were living at Clarence House, the 1825 Nash building they had occupied since their marriage. Buckingham Palace was the official seat of the monarch. The transfer was logical, expected, and apparently not immediate. The Royal Collection Trust, the authoritative institutional source on royal residences, records that Clarence House was prepared for the Queen Mother, who moved in shortly before the coronation in 1953. The coronation was June 2, 1953. George VI died in February 1952. The interval, the period during which the newly crowned Queen of the United Kingdom didn't occupy her official London residence, was approximately 15 to 16 months. This isn't an incendiary fact in isolation. Renovations take time. Grief disrupts practical planning. A household transition of this scale, in the middle of a period of national mourning and accession preparation, does not happen on a convenient schedule. These are real mitigating factors, but the physical reality it represents is precise. For more than a year after her accession, Elizabeth II wasn't in Buckingham Palace. Her mother was. The new Queen's official residence was occupied by the woman it had previously belonged to, and the accommodation of that reality was, on the record, handled by the daughter rather than resolved by the mother. Clarence House became the Queen Mother's London home from 1953 until her death in April 2002. 49 years. She had it repainted, redecorated, filled with her considerable art collection, and made into a social center that was warmly regarded by everyone who visited it. The Clarence House she left behind in 2002 was, by most accounts, one of the most beautifully maintained royal residences in London. It was also a house that required ongoing staff, ongoing maintenance, and ongoing financial support from somewhere. Physical space as proxy for psychological position. The rooms she occupied for 49 years after Buckingham Palace weren't simply rooms. They were the material expression of the title's promise, that she remained a queen in residence, not a widow in retirement. The title and the address reinforced each other. Both outlasted the reign they were supposed to have belonged to. The counter-argument has to be addressed directly, because it's a real one and the people who make it aren't wrong. Elizabeth II and her mother were genuinely close. This isn't disputed by any serious biographer. Their relationship was warm, sustained, and mutually reinforcing for essentially their entire adult lives. Sally Bedell Smith, who spent 3 months in the Royal Archives for her biography of George VI and Elizabeth, describes the family dynamic as foundational, the relationship between Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon and her elder daughter providing the emotional bedrock from which the future queen drew her sense of duty and stability. Multiple biographers working independently arrive at the same general characterization. This was a loving relationship, not a complicated one. Elizabeth II was present at her mother's death at Royal Lodge, Windsor, on March 30, 2002. When the Queen spoke publicly in the days following, she used language that wasn't diplomatic or scripted in the usual sense. "I thank you for the support you are giving me and my family as we come to terms with her death and the void she has left in our midst." The word void isn't palace language, it's grief language. It conveys something real about the presence that had been removed. So the question is the right one. If they were so close, how is this a burden story? The answer is structural, not personal. Closeness is precisely what made the institutional problem effectively impossible to quietly resolve. A monarch managing a difficult or estranged dowager can use distance as a management tool. She can gradually reform the financial arrangements, redirect the public role, reduce the public presence without personal cost. Elizabeth II had none of those levers available in any practical sense. She couldn't renegotiate her mother's parliamentary annuity in 1993. She had the constitutional authority to do so through the voluntary reimbursement mechanism, but she specifically chose not to. The Hansard record is clear on that. She couldn't suggest her mother relocate to a smaller establishment. She couldn't publicly acknowledge that the debts were generating a recurring problem that the monarchy was quietly absorbing. Because she loved her. Because the Queen Mother was the most popular member of the royal family throughout most of this period. Because any visible friction between them, any signal that the reigning queen found her mother's arrangements difficult, would have cost Elizabeth II more in public goodwill than absorbing the costs privately. The Queen Mother's popularity was a shield, and the daughter was behind it. The closeness wasn't a comfort in this situation. It was the mechanism that kept the institutional problem intact. Estrangement would have been simpler to manage, easier to distance, easier to gradually reduce. Love required absorbing. Love required the 1993 exception. Love required the Coutts overdraft, whenever it came, to be paid from the Duchy of Lancaster rather than acknowledged. This isn't a story about a bad mother. It's a story about how a very good mother, a beloved one, a historically significant one, used the structural affordances of her title, her public reputation, and her relationship with her daughter to remain central in ways that had genuine institutional and financial consequences. The closeness made it possible. The title made it durable. There is also the question of what the Queen Mother herself made of the arrangement. The evidence here is thinner than the financial record, but what exists is suggestive. The Shawcross biography, drawn from private papers, indicates a woman who found widowhood genuinely difficult, who experienced the transition from Queen Consort to Queen Mother as something more than bureaucratic reclassification. The fragment from coverage of the biography's release, Horrible Name, appears to describe something she wrote privately about a title or designation she disliked. Whether the object was Dowager, widowhood in general, or some aspect of her reduced status, the emotional record is consistent with a woman who experienced the transition as a diminishment she was determined not to fully accept. She had known what it was to be genuinely powerful, not in a constitutional sense, but in the deeper sense of public presence. To be photographed in the rubble of bombed streets and to be thanked for it. To receive the gratitude of a nation that credited her with holding the moral line during the worst years of the 20th century. The transition from that to the Queen Mother, ceremonially present, publicly beloved, but no longer beside a king, wasn't straightforwardly manageable for a woman who had spent 15 years at the center. The title she chose, or accepted, gave her what the alternative couldn't. It kept her inside the story, not the Dowager Queen Elizabeth, which places the emphasis on the death of her husband and the conclusion of her role. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, which places the emphasis on the living queen beside her and the relationship that connects them. One formulation describes an ending. The other describes an ongoing function. The 50-year span deserves its own weight. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was 51 when George VI died. She died herself on March 30, 2002, at the age of 101. The widowhood lasted 50 years, 1 month, and 24 days. That isn't a biographical footnote. It's longer than most adult careers, longer than most marriages, longer than the entire period between the 2 world wars. She outlived her husband by half a century. During that time, Elizabeth II reigned continuously. The daughter, who inherited the crown at 25, was 75 when her mother finally died. The entire visible arc of Elizabeth II's reign, from coronation to Silver Jubilee to Golden Jubilee, took place with her mother alive, publicly present, drawing a parliamentary annuity that grew from £95,000 to £643,000 across those decades, maintaining a full royal household, attending racing fixtures, and generating the chronic debt that the Shawcross biography, the Financial Times, and The Guardian all acknowledge independently. The Queen Mother outlived Queen Mary, who died in March 1953. She outlived Princess Margaret, who died on February 9, 2002, only 7 weeks before her mother. She outlived nearly everyone who had known her in the context of the war years. She continued carrying out public engagements into extreme old age. Her last was the recommissioning of HMS Ark Royal on November 22, 2001, 4 months before her death. She attended race meetings, hosted lunches at Clarence House, and remained a fixture of the royal calendar well past the point where any institutional expectation could reasonably have applied. The palace had a funeral plan for her for years, codenamed Operation Tay Bridge. The existence of that plan, known internally across at least the 1990s, captures something about the institutional management of her longevity. She had been expected to die, arrangements had been prepared, and the preparations kept not being needed. The 1990 annuity increase came 38 years into the widowhood. It wasn't a transitional provision or a temporary post-bereavement settlement. It was an active public commitment, renewed and expanded by parliamentary order, decade after decade. The trajectory from £95,000 in 1975 to £643,000 in 1990 isn't inflation adjustment. It's structural investment in a role that showed no sign of ending. When the Queen Mother died, the Guardian estimated her estate at approximately £26 million. She wasn't, at the end, financially ruined. The chronic debt and the substantial estate coexisted, as they often do for people of significant inherited wealth. The debt was current account and operational, against assets that included property, jewels, and entailed holdings that couldn't simply be sold to cover an overdraft. The Coutts situation and the eventual estate are both real. They aren't contradictory. What matters for this argument is the pattern across those 50 years, not the endpoint. A daughter who consistently absorbed her mother's financial gap, protecting the public annuity from voluntary reform, reportedly paying the private overdraft from the Duchy of Lancaster, managing the institutional consequences of a title that had no natural expiration date, is a daughter who was structurally encumbered in ways that the grief narrative alone can't explain. There is one final number from the parliamentary record worth naming precisely. In 1952, when Elizabeth II's own civil list was set at £475,000, the provision for the Queen Mother was a separate item under the same civil list legislation. Over the following 50 years, as Elizabeth II's civil list was adjusted and eventually fixed at £7.9 million annually from 1991 until its abolition in 2012, her mother's parliamentary annuity tracked alongside it, separate, specific, and protected. The 1993 arrangement that brought other royals' public costs under voluntary reimbursement explicitly excluded it. The Wikipedia article on the finances of the British royal family puts it plainly. Only the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the Queen Mother ever received direct funding from the civil list itself. Every other member of the royal family receiving public support had that support effectively refunded by the Queen from 1993 onward, with two exceptions, her husband and her mother. That is a precise picture of the financial hierarchy. At its center, the reigning Queen. Immediately protected, her consort and her mother. Everyone else, gradually absorbed. The Queen Mother's status in the financial architecture of the monarchy, across the entire second half of the 20th century, was equivalent to the Duke of Edinburgh's. Not peripheral, not charitable, central. The title sustained that centrality. A woman styled simply, the widow of George VI, does not occupy the same position in a parliamentary annuity framework as a woman styled Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The title wasn't separate from the financial entitlement. The title was part of the justification for it. March 30th, 2002. Royal Lodge, Windsor Great Park. 3:15 in the afternoon. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon died peacefully in her sleep, at 101, with her daughter beside her. Operation Tay Bridge activated. The nation moved through 10 days of mourning. The Queen Mother's coffin was brought to Westminster Hall, where an estimated 200,000 people queued along the Thames and over Lambeth Bridge to file past it over 3 days. At the funeral on April 9th at Westminster Abbey, the tenor bell sounded 101 times, once for each year of her life. 2,200 guests filled the Abbey. The service lasted 50 minutes. Her personal standard was lowered over Clarence House for the final time. She was interred in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, beside her husband, who had died 50 years before her. Her daughter was 75. She had been queen since 25. She had reigned for exactly 50 years with her mother alive, publicly present, drawing on public funds, occupying addresses, employing households, racing horses, and generating the kind of ongoing financial and institutional complexity that the title Queen Mother had made structurally impossible to quietly address. The title had worked precisely as it needed to work. It had kept the word Queen first. It had preserved identity, public rank, and, through the parliamentary annuity and the social expectation it enforced, Financial entitlement across half a century. A woman styled simply Queen Elizabeth, the widow of George VI, is a private person managing a private grief. A woman styled Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, is a public figure with a continuing role, a continuing allowance, a continuing claim on the monarchy's attention and resources, and a continuing connection to the crown that runs through her daughter, rather than stopping at her husband's death. The distinction between the two formulations wasn't accidental. It wasn't purely sentimental. It was chosen, by her reportedly, a few days after her husband died in 1952, and it lasted for 50 years because it answered the right question in the right way. Not, who was she, but who is she? Present tense, ongoing function, queen, and then, qualifying and deepening that queenship rather than diminishing it, mother. Elizabeth II loved her mother. She was present at the death. She used the word void. That grief was genuine. But grief does not settle debts. Grief does not retroactively reduce a parliamentary annuity. Grief does not explain the 15 months at Buckingham Palace, or the Hansard exception in 1993, or the Financial Times reference to an overdraft at Coutts paid from private funds, or the Shawcross biography's finding that the debt was chronic. The crown was hers from February 6, 1952. The cost of her mother's status, the title that preserved it, the spending it licensed, the institutional protection it required, remained hers for exactly 50 years. Being called Queen Mother left the word queen first. For Elizabeth II, that wasn't sentiment. It was the structure of the problem. Subscribe for more stories like this